June 19th, 1944, 2:47 a.m., Brest Peninsula, France. German Lieutenant Franz Weber crouched in his observation post, field glasses pressed against his face, watching something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he could see them, an entire American armored division assembling in the valley below. Hundreds of tanks, artillery batteries, supply convoys, the metallic sounds of treads and engines carried on the wind. Radio chatter crackled with American call signs. The ground itself seemed to vibrate with the weight of impending invasion. Weber's hand trembled as he reached for the field telephone to headquarters. Massive American concentration, grid reference 47-Baker Charlie. At least 200 armored vehicles. They're preparing for a major assault. What Lieutenant Weber didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that he was staring at the most elaborate lie ever told in warfare. Every tank he saw was made of inflatable rubber. Every radio transmission was scripted theatre. Every engine sound was recorded audio played through loudspeakers mounted on jeeps. The entire armored division was a fabrication created by 1,100 American soldiers, armed not with bullets, but with paintbrushes, sound effects, and theatrical props. Welcome to the Ghost Army. This is the story of how artists became warriors, how creativity became a weapon, and how a unit of designers, illustrators, radio actors, and sound engineers saved thousands of American lives by fighting World War II with the most unexpected arsenal imaginable: imagination itself. The Ghost Army's origin traces back to a May 1943 meeting at the Pentagon that would have seemed absurd to any conventional military mind. Major Ralph Ingersoll, a former magazine editor turned army planner, sat across from Colonel Billy Harris with a proposal so unconventional it bordered on fantasy. "What if we could make the Germans see divisions that don't exist?" Ingersoll asked, spreading reconnaissance photographs across the desk. "What if we could create entire armies out of thin air?" The concept wasn't entirely new. The British had experimented with dummy tanks in North Africa, simple wooden frames covered with canvas that fooled Luftwaffe reconnaissance from altitude. But Ingersoll envisioned something far more sophisticated, a complete multi-sensory deception combining visual, sonic, and electronic warfare into seamless illusions that could fool not just aerial observation, but ground reconnaissance, radio intelligence, and human witnesses. The Pentagon's response was immediate authorization. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was activated on January 20th, 1944, at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Its roster read like a directory of New York's art scene rather than a military unit. Fashion designers from 7th Avenue, billboard painters from Times Square, sound engineers from radio studios, set designers from Broadway, industrial designers from Madison Avenue advertising firms. Among them was Private First Class Arthur Shilstone, who had illustrated for major magazines. Sergeant Bill Blass, who would become one of America's most famous fashion designers. Private Ellsworth Kelly, destined to become a celebrated abstract painter. Art Kane, future legendary photographer. These weren't men who had dreamed of military glory. They were artists who had been drafted and somehow ended up in the strangest unit the US Army would ever field. Their commanding officer, Colonel Harry Reeder, understood he was leading something unprecedented. During their first formation at Camp Forest, he addressed the assembled unit with remarkable honesty. "Gentlemen, you're here because you can paint, sculpt, design, and think creatively. The Army needs you to lie, professional, convincing, elaborate lies that will save American lives. You'll be doing something no military unit has ever attempted. You'll be waging war with art." The Ghost Army's equipment was unlike anything in military inventory. Stored in specially modified trucks and warehouses were the tools of theatrical warfare. The inflatable tanks were marvels of engineering disguised as children's toys. Each dummy Sherman tank weighed only 85 pounds, light enough for 4 men to carry, yet when inflated with air compressors, they appeared completely authentic from more than 100 yards away. The rubber was specially treated to prevent reflective shine. Careful painting created the illusion of dimensional depth, shadows, wear patterns, and mud splatter. Fake track marks were pressed into soil using special rollers. Even the shadows cast by these rubber fabrications were calculated and adjusted throughout the day to match the sun's angle. But visual deception was only one layer. The sonic deception equipment was perhaps even more remarkable. Engineers had traveled to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and recorded actual armored units in operation. They captured the specific sounds of Sherman tanks starting, idling, moving at various speeds and shutting down, half-tracks grinding gears, artillery pieces being positioned, supply trucks in convoy, infantry units on the march. These recordings were pressed onto custom-made sound effect records and played through massive 500-pound speakers that could project audio up to 15 miles under ideal conditions. Private First Class Arthur Shilstone later recalled his first demonstration of the sonic equipment. They played us a recording of a tank battalion moving into position. The sound was so perfect, so authentic, that several men instinctively looked around for the actual tanks. We were standing in an empty field, but your ears told you that you were surrounded by armor. It was deeply unsettling. That's when I understood what we were actually going to do. We were going to lie so convincingly that reality itself would seem false. The radio deception component, called special effects in official documents, was equally sophisticated. The unit included experienced radio operators who had memorized the communication patterns, call signs, and transmission characteristics of actual Army divisions. They could replicate the complete radio signature of an entire armored division. Command nets, fire direction networks, logistics channels, even the casual chatter between units that German signals intelligence monitored obsessively. The Ghost Army even had spoof radio devices that could transmit false messages while creating the electronic signature of a completely different location, making German direction-finding equipment point to phantom units dozens of miles from the actual transmission source. Training for theater of war. Camp Forest became a surreal combination of military base and film studio. While conventional units drilled with weapons, the Ghost Army practiced different skills entirely. Artists studied camouflage techniques, learning to paint shadows that didn't exist and highlights that created false dimensions. They memorized the exact markings, dimensions, and weathering patterns of every Allied vehicle type. A German observer with binoculars needed to see authentic details, the right division insignia, appropriate wear patterns, correct mounting brackets, even the mud splatter consistent with recent maneuvers. The sonic deception teams practiced what they called sonic stories, carefully scripted audio performances that told convincing narratives through sound alone. Moving a fake armored division into position wasn't just playing tank sounds. It required a carefully timed sequence, distant convoy sounds approaching, individual vehicles arriving at different times, engines shutting down in staggered sequence, the clanking of maintenance work, crew voices, mess operations, then gradual restart and departure sounds. Each performance required meticulous timing and coordination across multiple speaker positions. Private Harold Dahl, a former theater sound designer from Chicago, described the creative challenge. We were essentially creating radio plays for an audience that was trying to kill us. Every sound had to tell a story. German intelligence officers were trained to identify units by their audio signatures. They knew what a tank battalion sounded like, moving, resting, preparing for attack. We had to create performances that would fool experts who had years of experience listening to real armored units. The rehearsals grew increasingly elaborate. The unit practiced complete deception operations, inflating dummy equipment under simulated combat conditions, coordinating visual and sonic elements, maintaining radio deceptions for days, and critically disappearing without trace when the operation concluded. German reconnaissance couldn't discover deflated rubber and speaker equipment. Everything had to vanish as completely as it had appeared. Colonel Reeder instituted one non-negotiable rule: absolute secrecy. The men were forbidden from discussing their unit's purpose, even with other American soldiers. They were issued standard infantry shoulder patches for their dress uniforms. Their official designation, 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, was deliberately vague. Even their families received censored letters that mentioned nothing about the unit's actual mission. This enforced secrecy created a strange psychological dynamic, as Private Ned Harris later reflected. We were training to become professional liars, but we had to be honest with ourselves about what that meant. We were going to send men into battle based on our deceptions. German units would deploy to face our phantom armies, leaving real positions vulnerable. Real soldiers would fight and die because we painted fake shadows on rubber tanks. That weight sat heavy on all of us. The Ghost Army shipped to England in early May 1944, their specialized equipment carefully crated and marked with misleading manifests. They arrived at Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's birthplace, appropriately enough for a unit of theatrical warriors, and immediately began preparations for their combat debut. The first operation, codenamed Elephant, was scheduled for June 10, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day. While the world's attention focused on Normandy, the Ghost Army would stage a completely different invasion threat near Brest, on France's western peninsula. The mission was ambitious and terrifying, convinced German intelligence that the US 2nd Armored Division was preparing to assault Brest from the south, drawing German reserves away from the actual fighting in Normandy. The deception would need to fool German aerial reconnaissance, ground observers, signals intelligence, and potentially even French civilians who might report to German authorities. Planning sessions revealed the complexity. Major Frederick Fox, commanding the visual deception team, spread topographical maps across the briefing room. We need terrain that provides cover for inflation operations, but allows visibility from known German observation posts. We need to account for prevailing winds affecting sound projection. We need multiple radio transmission points to create believable unit dispersal. And we need escape routes because if this fails, we'll have German armor rolling over us. The unit crossed the English Channel on June 9th, landing at Utah Beach amid the chaos of ongoing operations. The beaches were still littered with destroyed landing craft and equipment. Artillery rumbled in the distance. This was no longer rehearsal. They reached their staging area, a series of fields and forests southeast of Brest, after dark on June 10th. The inflation teams immediately began their work, moving with practiced efficiency, despite the pounding hearts and sweating hands that came with first combat. Sergeant Victor Dowd, leading one of the inflation teams, later described that first night. We worked in almost complete darkness, feeling our way through the process we'd rehearsed dozens of times. The air compressors sounded impossibly loud. Every noise made us certain Germans were about to open fire. It took 4 hours to inflate and position our 1st Battalion, about 40 dummy tanks, half-tracks and artillery pieces. When dawn broke and I saw them in morning light, scattered across that French countryside looking absolutely real, I felt simultaneously proud and terrified. We'd created something convincing enough to deceive trained observers. Now we had to hope it actually worked. The sonic deception began at 0400 hours. Carefully positioned speakers broadcast the sounds of an armored division preparing for operations. Engines warming, treads moving, radio chatter, maintenance work. The volume was calibrated to reach known German listening posts without seeming artificially amplified. The radio deception team, operating from 3 different transmission points, began broadcasting the complete electronic signature of the 2nd Armored Division. They used authentic call signs obtained from the real division, replicated communication patterns, and even incorporated deliberately sloppy radio discipline, occasional breaches of protocol that German signals intelligence had learned to expect from American units. The visual elements required constant maintenance. Teams with paint and materials moved between the dummy vehicles, adjusting details as light conditions changed, adding weathering, creating the appearance of ongoing activity. From German observation posts miles away, the scene appeared to show hundreds of soldiers preparing equipment, conducting maintenance, and organizing for a major operation. For 3 days, the Ghost Army maintained this elaborate performance while sleeping in shifts, eating cold rations, and living with the constant fear of discovery. German artillery occasionally fired ranging shots, forcing the men to shelter in hastily dug slit trenches while hoping the shells wouldn't hit their rubber tanks and reveal the deception. The confirmation came through intelligence channels on June 13th. Ultra, the Allied code-breaking operation, had decrypted German communications showing that Wehrmacht headquarters believed a major American armored force was preparing to assault Brest. 2 German divisions that had been moving toward Normandy were halted and redirected to defend against the phantom threat. Operation Elephant was a complete success. 2 German divisions, approximately 30,000 troops, had been deceived by 1,100 Americans armed with inflatable rubber and sound equipment. Operation Elephant established the template, but each subsequent mission grew more sophisticated as the unit learned from experience and developed new techniques. Operation Brittany in August 1944 demonstrated their growing creativity. The mission called for simulating the US 6th Armored Division, suggesting it was preparing to assault the port city of Brest, while the real division moved east toward Paris. The sonic team developed new techniques, creating march sounds, audio of a division moving along roads. They positioned speakers at intervals and broadcast sequence recordings that suggested a massive convoy passing through the countryside. French civilians reported hearing American tanks and trucks moving for hours, exactly as intended. The visual deception team added new wrinkles. They created dummy soldiers, stuffed uniforms positioned in guard posts and checkpoints. From a distance, they appeared to be sentries. They even created dummy artillery flashes using pyrotechnic charges that simulated muzzle blasts at night, suggesting active fire, missions that didn't exist. Private Jack Maisie, who would later become a renowned industrial designer, developed an innovation that became standard procedure: the atmosphere details. These were small visual elements that added authenticity. Laundry lines between dummy vehicles, fake supply dumps with carefully stacked empty boxes, even portable signs indicating unit designations and traffic control markers. The Germans weren't just looking for tanks, Maisie explained. They were looking for evidence of a complete military operation. We learned to create all the supporting details that suggested thousands of soldiers, not just vehicles. Operation Bettenburg in September 1944 introduced the concept of personality to the deceptions. The radio team began incorporating character into their fake transmissions, creating fictional officers with distinctive communication styles. Captain Mitchell had a clipped, efficient radio manner. Lieutenant Chen frequently used humor in his transmissions. Major Rodriguez was notoriously verbose. German intelligence officers monitoring these transmissions over days or weeks began to know these personalities. When the same voices and communication patterns appeared in different locations, German intelligence concluded that specific units had relocated, exactly as the Ghost Army intended. They were creating fictional characters so convincing that enemy intelligence officers tracked them like real people. The deception in Luxembourg, from October through December 1944, became the unit's most sustained operation. For nearly 2 months, they simulated the presence of the US 75th Infantry Division, allowing the real division to secretly reposition for offensive operations. This extended operation required unprecedented attention to detail. The visual deception teams rotated dummy equipment positions to simulate unit movement and reorganization. They created progressive wear patterns on the dummy vehicles to suggest weeks of use. They even arranged for actual supply trucks to deliver real provisions to the fake division, knowing German observers watched supply operations to assess unit strength. The sonic performances evolved into what the team called daily life sounds, creating audio environments that suggested a division at rest: morning reveille calls, mess operations, vehicle maintenance, evening wind down. These weren't dramatic sounds of combat preparation, but the mundane audio texture of military life that German intelligence knew well. Private Harold Dahl described the creative challenge. We essentially composed a 2-month-long symphony of deception. Every day required a different movement in the composition. Some days suggested training operations, others implied rest and refit. Occasionally, we'd broadcast preparation sounds to suggest imminent action, keeping German intelligence focused on the Phantom Division. It was exhausting, creatively and psychologically. We were performing a show where the audience was trying to kill us, and the performance could never break character. The strange nature of their service created unique psychological pressures. The Ghost Army men lived in a constant state of creative tension, simultaneously artists and soldiers, performers and combatants, creators and deceivers. Private Ellsworth Kelly, who painted geometric abstractions in whatever spare time he found, later reflected on this duality. We were using artistic skills to enable killing. Every successful deception meant German forces moved to fight our illusions instead of real American units. We were saving American lives by ensuring Germans died fighting shadows. There was a moral complexity to that. We took pride in our craft while being disturbed by its purpose. The men dealt with danger differently than conventional infantry. When German artillery targeted their positions, they couldn't fight back. Returning fire would reveal they weren't an actual armoured division. They could only shelter and hope the shells missed both them and their rubber equipment. Sergeant Bill Blass recalled a near miss during Operation Bettemborg. A German 88mm shell landed maybe 50 yards from our inflation team, close enough that shrapnel punched holes in 3 of our dummy tanks. We had to quickly deflate them, patch the rubber, re-inflate and repaint the weathering patterns, all while knowing that German spotters might be watching and timing our repair work to assess our capabilities. We were fixing props in the middle of a performance where the critics had artillery. The unit developed a dark humour about their circumstances. They joked about being the only soldiers who could be destroyed by a strong wind. They referred to their dummy equipment as the cast and operations as shows or performances. They called themselves the Rubber Army, the Blow-Up Boys, and most commonly the Ghost Army, a nickname that began as self-deprecating humour and evolved into a badge of pride. But beneath the humour was genuine courage. The Ghost Army operated by necessity on the front lines, or even ahead of advancing Allied forces. They were lightly armed, standard infantry weapons only, and completely unable to defend against any serious German attack. If their deceptions were discovered and German forces attacked, they would be overrun in minutes. Private Arthur Shilstone wrote in his diary, "Conventional soldiers at least have the comfort of knowing they can fight back. We're armed with paintbrushes pretending to be artillery. If the Germans figure out what we are, we're dead. There's something uniquely terrifying about that. We're simultaneously invisible and exposed, powerful and helpless." The Ghost Army's most ambitious and successful operation came in March 1945 during Operation Viersen, the deception supporting the Allied crossing of the Rhine River, Germany's last major defensive barrier. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group planned to cross the Rhine near Wesel on March 23, 1945. The operation would involve over 250,000 troops, massive artillery bombardment and airborne assaults, a hammer blow intended to shatter German defences. But German forces would concentrate everything against an obvious crossing attempt. The Ghost Army's mission simulates 2 complete American divisions, the 30th Infantry and 79th Infantry Divisions, preparing to cross the Rhine 10 miles south of the actual crossing site, drawing German reserves to defend against a phantom assault. The planning was meticulous. Major Ralph Ingersoll, coordinating with Montgomery's intelligence staff, designed a multi-week deception that would unfold in carefully scripted phases, building credibility gradually rather than suddenly announcing 2 divisions' presence. Phase 1 began March 18th with radio deception. The signals team began broadcasting low-level traffic, suggesting advanced reconnaissance elements probing the southern crossing sites. Just occasional transmissions, subtle enough to seem like preliminary operations rather than an obvious deception. Phase 2 added visual elements. Small teams positioned individual dummy vehicles near the proposed crossing sites, not full divisions, just scattered elements suggesting units beginning to arrive. German aerial reconnaissance photographed exactly what the Ghost Army intended, early indicators of a build-up. Phase 3 ramped up dramatically. On March 20th, the full visual deception deployed. Within 12 hours, the Ghost Army inflated and positioned over 600 pieces of dummy equipment, tanks, artillery, supply trucks, tank destroyers, anti-aircraft guns, communication vehicles. The equipment was arranged in proper tactical deployment, spread across the landscape exactly as two divisions would position for a river crossing assault. The sonic deception created an overwhelming audio environment. Multiple speaker positions broadcast overlapping sounds of two divisions preparing for combat. Vehicle movements, artillery positioning, engineering operations preparing crossing equipment, command posts buzzing with activity. The carefully layered audio created an immersive soundscape that convinced even some American units passing through the area that major forces were deploying. The radio deception reached new levels of sophistication. The signals team broadcast the complete communications architecture of two divisions: command nets, fire control channels, logistics networks, engineering frequencies discussing bridge construction, even medical channels arranging casualty evacuation procedures. They incorporated command conferences, scripted radio discussions between fictional senior officers debating crossing tactics and timing. Private Bernie Mason, part of the radio deception team, later described the intensity. "We were performing around the clock. We'd memorized the radio procedures and communication patterns so thoroughly that we essentially became the units we were simulating. I was a fire direction officer coordinating artillery support for a crossing that would never happen. My partner was an engineering officer arranging bridging equipment that didn't exist. We had entire conversations about tactical problems in units that were figments of our imagination." Despite operating primarily as deceivers rather than combatants, the Ghost Army suffered casualties that revealed the genuine danger of their work. Operation Viersen, their Rhine crossing deception, nearly ended in catastrophe when German artillery began targeting their dummy positions. The barrage was intense and accurate, suggesting German observers had spotted the American divisions preparing to cross. Private First Class Edward Blow was killed instantly when a shell landed directly on the truck where he was preparing sonic equipment. Two other men from his team were seriously wounded. The remaining team members had to continue inflating dummy equipment and maintaining the deception, while medics evacuated their casualties, knowing that abandoning the operation would waste their comrades' sacrifice. Sergeant George Martin, who was 20 yards from the fatal shell strike, later said, "Eddie was killed maintaining a deception. He died protecting a lie that saved real soldiers' lives. There was something profound and terrible about that. We couldn't even mark his death properly. No firefight to report, no enemy attack to document. Just a routine casualty from harassment fire in official records. His family would never know he died as an artist at war." Other casualties came from the nature of their forward operations. The Ghost Army often operated in advance of Allied lines, positioning their deceptions in areas still contested or only nominally secured. Several men were wounded or killed by German patrols, snipers, or mines. Private Jack Maisie narrowly survived a German patrol encounter during Operation Brittany. His team was inflating dummy vehicles in a forest clearing when 6 German soldiers emerged from the tree line. "We were armed with paintbrushes and air compressors," Maisie recalled. "We had 3 rifles among 8 men. The Germans stared at our rubber tanks, trying to process what they were seeing. For maybe 5 seconds, nobody moved. Then their sergeant raised his rifle and we scattered. 2 of our guys were captured. The rest of us escaped, but we had to abandon all our equipment. Those 2 men spent the rest of the war in a POW camp because they were caught inflating fake tanks. How do you explain that to their families?" The psychological casualties were harder to quantify. Several men suffered what we'd now recognize as PTSD, not from direct combat, but from the unique stresses of their service. The constant deception created a form of cognitive dissonance. They were soldiers who never fired weapons in anger, warriors whose battles were performances, combatants whose victories came from convincing enemies to fight illusions. Private Arthur Shillstone's diary entries from late 1944 reveal this psychological strain. "I paint shadows that aren't there. I create dimensions that don't exist. I've become so practiced at deception that I sometimes forget what's real. Today I looked at an actual Sherman tank and my first thought was to assess whether it was convincing. I'm losing the ability to distinguish performance from reality. What does that make me?" The silence after. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Ghost Army's war ended not with celebration but with secrecy. The men were immediately sworn to strict silence about their operations. All of their specialized equipment, the dummy tanks, sonic equipment, and radio devices, was collected and classified as top secret. Official unit records were sealed. The men were forbidden from discussing their service with anyone, including family. Their discharge papers listed them as members of conventional headquarters units with no mention of deception operations. Even among themselves, the Ghost Army veterans rarely discussed their war. Private Bill Blass returned to New York and built a fashion empire, never mentioning his military service beyond vague references to headquarters work. Ellsworth Kelly became a celebrated abstract painter, his war years a mysterious gap in his biography. Arthur Shilstone illustrated for major publications, keeping silent about illustrating false realities in France. The classified nature of their service created a strange psychological burden. These men had participated in some of the war's most creative and effective operations, saving thousands of lives through unique applications of artistic skill. But they couldn't share their stories, couldn't explain the pride and trauma of their service, couldn't be properly honored for their contributions. Sergeant George Martin later reflected, "We won a war with art, but couldn't tell anyone about it. Conventional veterans could share their experiences, find community in their service, be recognized for their sacrifices. We went home and said nothing. We'd done something extraordinary and had to pretend we hadn't. That silence was its own kind of wound." The Ghost Army remained classified for 51 years. It wasn't until 1996 that the unit's operations were declassified and their story could finally be told. By then, many of the veterans had died, carrying their secrets to graves marked only with conventional service information. When journalists finally interviewed surviving Ghost Army veterans in the late 1990s and 2000s, they discovered men who were simultaneously proud and troubled by their wartime service. They had done extraordinary things but lived with complicated feelings about using creativity as a weapon. Jack Maisie, interviewed at age 82, articulated this complexity. "We saved lives by enabling death. We used art to help win a just war through fundamentally dishonest means. I'm proud of what we did and disturbed by what it represented. We proved that creativity could be weaponized, that artists could be warriors, that imagination could kill. I'm not sure the world needed that lesson, even though I'm glad we taught it to the Nazis." The legacy of illusion. The Ghost Army's operations established principles of military deception that remain classified and operational to this day. Modern military deception units, whose very existence is often classified, trace their lineage directly to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The combination of visual, sonic, and electronic deception developed by the Ghost Army became standard doctrine. The understanding that human perception could be systematically fooled through multisensory illusions revolutionized military thinking about deception operations. But perhaps the Ghost Army's most important legacy was demonstrating that creativity itself could be a weapon, that artists, designers, and performers could contribute to military operations in ways that conventional soldiers couldn't match. In 2013, the Ghost Army veterans finally received official recognition when Congress awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. The ceremony at the U.S. Capitol featured speeches acknowledging that these artists and designers had saved an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 American lives through their deception operations. The few surviving veterans, most in their 90s, attended in wheelchairs and with assisted care. Their acceptance speeches were brief but profound. Private First Class Bernard Bluestein, aged 92, spoke for many when he said, "We were artists who became soldiers, but we never stopped being artists. We just learned to paint with different materials, rubber instead of canvas, sound instead of music, radio waves instead of words. We created illusions that saved lives. That's not a bad legacy for a bunch of painters and designers who got drafted." The Ghost Army's story raises profound questions about the nature of warfare, creativity, and truth. They fought a just war through elaborate deceptions. They saved lives by creating convincing lies. They were simultaneously artists and warriors, creators and deceivers, honest men who became professional liars in service of a moral cause. In 2019, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans opened a permanent Ghost Army exhibition featuring some of the declassified dummy equipment, sonic devices, and artifacts from their operations. The centerpiece is a partially inflated dummy Sherman tank displayed alongside photographs of Ghost Army operations. The exhibit's closing text captures the unit's paradoxical legacy. These men proved that creativity could be a weapon as powerful as any gun. They demonstrated that imagination, properly deployed, could save more lives than firepower. They showed that artists could be warriors and warriors could be artists. They won battles that never happened and saved soldiers who never knew they were in danger. They were the Ghost Army, invisible, unconventional, and unforgettable. Epilogue: The Cost of Silence. Franz Weber, the German lieutenant who observed the Phantom American Division near Brest in June 1944, survived the war and returned to his home in Bavaria. He never forgot what he saw that night, or thought he saw. In a 1982 interview discovered decades later, Weber reflected on his wartime experience. For years after the war, I was certain of what I'd observed: an entire American armored division preparing to assault Brest. I reported it confidently, German forces redeployed based on my observations. Only decades later did I learn the truth. I'd been fooled by inflatable rubber and sound effects. Everything I saw was an elaborate American deception. When I finally learned this, I felt simultaneously foolish and impressed. Foolish because I'd been completely deceived, impressed because the Americans had created illusions so perfect that a trained military observer couldn't detect them. They'd weaponized theater and art in ways I'd never imagined possible. War is usually about destroying things. The Americans won battles by creating things, creating convincing illusions of forces that didn't exist. There's something profound about that. They understood that perception is reality in warfare. What the enemy believes is true becomes true in terms of how they respond. The Americans didn't defeat us just with superior numbers or equipment. They defeated us by making us see realities that didn't exist, by making us fight ghosts. The last surviving member of the Ghost Army, Private George Martin, died in 2023 at age 100. His obituary finally, publicly, detailed his service with the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, information that would have been classified for most of his life. At his funeral, Martin's grandson read from a letter Martin had written but never sent, discovered among his effects. We were artists who went to war. We fought with paintbrushes and speakers instead of guns. We saved lives by creating elaborate lies. I'm proud of what we did and troubled by what it means. We proved that creativity could be weaponized, that imagination could kill, that art could serve warfare. I don't know if the world is better for learning that lesson, but I know that thousands of American soldiers came home to their families because we convinced Germans to fight rubber tanks and radio waves instead of real men. If that's what it took to defeat fascism, then I'm glad we did it. But I'll die wondering whether we opened a door that should have stayed closed, whether weaponizing creativity crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed, even in a just war. We were the Ghost Army. We fought battles that never happened. We won victories nobody saw. We were warriors who never fired a shot in anger, and artists who never created beauty. We existed in the shadows between truth and lies, reality and illusion, creativity and destruction. History will remember the soldiers who stormed beaches and captured cities. We did something stranger. We made the enemy see armies that didn't exist and fight battles against illusions. I don't know what that makes us, but I know we saved lives. That has to count for something. The Ghost Army's story ends where it began, in the spaces between reality and illusion, art and warfare, truth and deception. There were 1,100 artists who became soldiers, creators who became warriors, honest men who became professional liars in service of saving lives. They fought World War II armed with paintbrushes, speakers, and inflatable tanks. They won battles that never happened and saved soldiers who never knew they were saved. They were invisible warriors fighting visible wars with invisible weapons. They were the Ghost Army. And their legacy remains as paradoxical as their service. Creativity is powerful enough to save lives, but only by enabling death. Art can be a weapon, but weaponizing art changes both art and warfare in ways we're still understanding. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson the Ghost Army taught, that in total war, even beauty and imagination become weapons. And once creativity has been weaponized, it can never be entirely innocent again. The ghosts have been laid to rest, but the questions they raise continue to haunt us.